A single toll echoed through the mist. Low, ancient, and impossibly real. No bell was seen, yet all who heard it felt its weight in their bones. Beneath a ruined chapel, something long buried was calling, and the silence that followed spoke of guilt, fear, and a truth that refused to stay hidden. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was upon a bleak and gust-laden November evening that I found myself once more ensconced in the familiar warmth of our sitting room at 221 B Baker Street. The wind howled down the chimneys with a peculiar shrillness, and the rain beat a steady tattoo against the window panes, blurring the orange gaslight beyond into formless blotches of flame. Inside, however, the crackle of the fire and the familiar silhouette of Sherlock Holmes, motionless in his armchair, fingertips pressed together beneath his chin, lent an atmosphere of composed reflection that defied the storm's intrusion. He had spoken little for the better part of an hour, though his eyes betrayed a restless energy that I had long since learned to associate with some subtle process of deduction underway. I myself had laid aside my medical journal in favour of silent observation, for it was on such nights that Holmes's mind, untethered by active employment, would turn to the strangest of mental excursions which, though abstract, often bore fruit of astonishing clarity. It was in such a silence that the spark of this case, though neither of us yet knew it, was first struck. Holmes reached for the folded Times upon the table and opened it with a flick, scanning the columns with eyes that missed nothing. After a moment, he emitted a faint sound, not quite a chuckle, but something akin to intellectual amusement. "Here is something for your interest, Watson," he said, passing the paper to me and tapping a small notice buried in the lower quarter of page 6. "A certain Mr. Archibald Graves, an amateur antiquarian from Kent, claims to have recorded a low-frequency harmonic vibration in the vicinity of Drowning Hill. He attributes it, rather fancifully, to ancient geological forces, though he notes, quite specifically, that the tone corresponds to that of an iron bell, long thought lost beneath the ruins of St. Ethelric's Chapel." I raised an eyebrow at the curious mixture of science and superstition. An echo of the past. "Or perhaps," said Holmes, leaning back, "something more corporeal." "Consider the facts as presented," Holmes began, his gaze narrowing with the intensity of one who peers into a mental abyss. "A harmonic vibration is recorded, corresponding precisely to a bell reputedly buried for over a century. That alone would not trouble me, were it not for the tone being slightly displaced in frequency from its historical register." I blinked. "You mean to say—" "I mean to say," he interrupted gently, "that the bell has moved. If Graves's instruments detected a sympathetic vibration, then the source must now be above ground, exposed to air rather than muffled by earth. The subtle shift in pitch, Watson, betrays it. Metal, once freed from the damp clutches of soil and stone, vibrates differently, just enough for those who listen closely." "And yet no mention is made of any excavation," I said. "Precisely. Which leads one to ask, who would retrieve a bell reputed to toll for the dead, and do so in silence? Not an archaeologist seeking acclaim, but one with another motive altogether." I regarded him in wonder. "You speak as though the matter were already solved." He allowed himself the faintest smile. "Merely sketched. The lines, however, are suggestive." I could not help but marvel at the elegance of his deduction, a feat plucked from a few inches of newsprint, absent any eyewitness, telegram, or appeal for aid. And yet, to my astonishment, Holmes made no further inquiry. The newspaper was folded again, the fire stoked with the end of a poker, and the topic, it seemed, laid to rest. "You do not intend to investigate?" I asked, surprised. Holmes shook his head. "The bell has not summoned me, Watson. At least, not yet." Had he known then how swiftly the echoes from Drowning Hill would reach even the gas-lit quietude of Baker Street? I dare say he might have reconsidered those words. For scarcely 3 days later, a knock upon our door, timed with uncanny precision to the striking of midnight, would usher in a case unlike any we had faced before, one that rang not only with mystery, but with something far older and darker still. 3 nights after Holmes had spoken those curious words, "The bell has not summoned me, Watson. At least, not yet." We were roused by an urgent knock upon our door. The hour was late and the storm outside unabated. Mrs. Hudson had long since retired, and so it was Holmes himself who answered, ushering in a figure cloaked in sodden black and visibly trembling. She was a woman of perhaps 30 years, her features striking more from their intensity than beauty, though her eyes, wide and searching beneath the weight of recent terror, carried a sincerity that instantly appealed to my sympathies. She identified herself as Miss Eliza Brand, governess to the household of Colonel Ambrose Vane of Greyshollow, a rural estate perched at the edge of the region known ominously as Drowning Hill. Her voice quivered with urgency, and it was clear she had travelled through the storm by coach, perhaps even on foot, to reach us. Holmes, with his customary courtesy but no dilution of scrutiny, gestured for her to sit by the fire. "You are safe here, Miss Brand," he said gently. "Now, compose yourself. Speak slowly. Tell us what has brought you through such weather, and why you have come to me." Her gloved hands clutched to her satchel, and when she spoke, her voice, though faint, bore the unmistakable resonance of truth touched by fear. "It is the child, Mr. Holmes," she began. "Miss Agnes, she has vanished." With that single declaration, her composure nearly collapsed, and she pressed a handkerchief to her mouth as if to stifle the emotion. Holmes offered no interruption, merely a glance in my direction, as if inviting me to listen not only to her words, but to the intervals between them. "She is 9 years of age," Miss Brand continued, "and was left in my care for the most part by Colonel Vane, her father, who is a man of solitary habits and difficult moods. The house itself is old, remote, and nearly encircled by the fog banks of Drowning Hill. It is an oppressive place, but the girl was bright, inquisitive, and fond of reading. 2 nights passed," she went on. "Agnes retired to her bed at the usual hour. I checked on her shortly after 10. The next morning her bed had not been slept in. The servants knew nothing. Her father refused to call for the police and instead blamed me for laxity of supervision. But I knew with certainty, that something unnatural had occurred." Holmes folded his hands. "Unnatural?" She nodded. "Sir, there is an old chapel ruin atop the hill, St. Ethelric's. The villagers say that its bell tolls on nights when death is near. It was destroyed in the Reformation, yet they claim to hear it even now. I do not believe in such things, Mr. Holmes. And yet, on the very night the child disappeared, I too heard the bell. It tolled once, only once, from the hill." Holmes's brow creased, but he said nothing. "I begged the Colonel to search the chapel," she whispered, "but he dismissed me. I came to you instead. I fear what I do not understand, and I fear even more that what is said to be myth may be but a veil for something darker still." Holmes remained silent for a full 30 seconds, his gaze fixed not upon Miss Brand, but upon the coals as though they bore the shape of her account. Then he stood, crossed to the bookshelf, and removed a slim volume bound in green leather. "I thought as much," he murmured, leafing through a section on Kentish ecclesiastical ruins. "St. Ethelric's Chapel, burned in 1549, rebuilt partially in 1792, abandoned in 1831 after a lightning strike cracked the belfry. He turned to face us. The bell was reputedly of Norman casting, iron-clad bronze with a deep resonance. Local records say it was lost to a sinkhole or landslip sometime after the abandonment. Miss Brand leaned forward. Then how could it have told Mr. Holmes? There is no bell, and yet I heard it. I know what I heard. Holmes's expression remained unreadable. Did you hear it alone? She hesitated. Number Mrs. Elkins, the cook, came rushing to me in fright, and one of the grooms said he'd heard something in the fog, though he swore it was just the wind. And the child was gone by morning, Holmes said quietly. Yes, vanished. The room seemed to grow colder, though the fire had not dimmed. Holmes looked toward the window, where the rain still streaked the glass in trembling lines. Watson, he said, almost absently, do you recall our discussion earlier this week? I nodded, my mind beginning to race. The bell has tolled, he said simply, and it appears it was no echo after all. Holmes returned to his chair and fixed Miss Brand with a gaze that was, though penetrating, not unkind. You are observant, articulate, and I suspect, not easily rattled, he said. It was no small thing to defy your employer and come to London in the dead of night. That speaks in your favour, Miss Brand. Her composure wavered again, and she inclined her head in silent gratitude. As to the matter itself, Holmes continued, there is much in your account which invites scrutiny. The missing child, the disused chapel, the sudden reappearance of a long-lost sound. But what interests me most is not the bell, nor even the girl. No? I asked. It is the Colonel, Holmes said, a man who refuses the aid of the law when his only daughter vanishes into mist and myth. That, Watson, is the point at which the case ceases to be folklore and becomes a matter for reason. He stood briskly. Pack a bag, Watson. We leave on the morning train for Kent. Miss Brand, you shall accompany us. And so it was that the legend of Drowning Hill crossed our threshold, not as a tale, but as a summons. The morning train bore us steadily southeastward through the Kentish countryside, the sky pressing low above the landscape like a lid upon a pot near boiling. As we left the bustle of London behind, the scenery grew increasingly desolate, wide fields bristling with frost, trees hunched like penitents beneath the weight of advancing fog, and lonely milestones glimpsed like gravestones through the window pane. Miss Brand sat across from us, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, saying little. Her composure had returned somewhat, though it seemed held in place by sheer determination. Holmes spent the bulk of the journey in contemplative silence, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. Once or twice he made a note in his pocketbook, but otherwise remained immobile, as though his faculties were turned inward. As the train neared the small, unremarkable station at Gray's-Hollow, Miss Brand pointed silently to the distant rise to the north, a bald, grass-covered hill shrouded at its summit by a permanent ring of mist. Atop it, like a broken tooth against the grey sky, stood the remains of the ruined chapel. Even at that distance, something about it stirred an unease in me that I could not rationally explain. Holmes, seeing my reaction, murmured, "It is not always the shape of a thing that disturbs us, Watson, but what we unconsciously recall it to resemble." The Vane estate stood half-concealed behind yew hedges and ivy-choked walls, its ancient windows blinking mournfully through the morning mist. It was a house not so much inhabited as endured, bearing the air of a family home long surrendered to ghosts. The great oak doors opened reluctantly beneath Miss Brand's knock, revealing a grey-haired housekeeper with a face like a shuttered window. We were shown through a hall lined with ancestral portraits whose features had faded into shadows. The atmosphere within was colder than the air outside, despite the smouldering hearths, and the silence of the place clung to the skin like damp linen. Miss Brand, took us to the parlour, where we met no one save a maid who refused to meet our eyes. Holmes glanced at the corners of the room, at the pattern of dust on the table legs, and then, without comment, made his way toward the wide bay window that looked out upon the slope of Drowning Hill. "It is a curious silence," he remarked, "when even the floors do not creak in protest." Miss Brand made no reply, but I saw her glance toward the staircase with attention that had nothing to do with draught or chill. That afternoon, Holmes and I ascended the path to Drowning Hill. The fog thickened as we climbed, veiling the chapel until it seemed to materialize from the ether like the skeleton of some long-dead cathedral. The structure, though crumbling, retained enough form to suggest its former sanctity, now replaced by desolation. Ivy and lichen clung to its stone ribs, and the altar, half sunken into the earth, lay littered with wet leaves and broken twigs. Holmes moved with quiet deliberation, his eyes scanning each stone, each rusted hinge, each footprint in the soft earth. It was he who paused first, not at the altar itself, but several paces behind it, where the leaf bed had been disturbed in an oddly circular fashion. He knelt, and with his gloved hands brushed away the damp debris to reveal a porcelain face, pale, cracked, and sightless. A child's doll. Its bonnet had rotted away, but a single shoe still clung to the stiff cloth of its leg. He did not speak, but held the object up for my inspection. "A girl might part with her doll willingly," I offered, "but not leave it like this." Holmes nodded. "Indeed, Watson, not unless in great haste or great fear." We stepped inside the shell of the chapel, what remained of the vaulted roof open to the lowering sky. Rain had darkened the stones and left the moss glistening in the corners. Holmes, ever the meticulous observer, raised his lantern and peered upward into the remaining support beams where a bell might once have hung. "There," he said, directing my gaze to a horizontal beam near the rear wall. Upon it was a shallow but unmistakable groove, freshly worn by the look of it, as though a rope had passed repeatedly over it under considerable tension. Holmes produced a magnifying lens and examined the wood. Slight charring, but no rot. A recent friction, not centuries old. A rope has been used here, Watson, and not idly. He crouched near the base of the wall and pointed out a small iron ring, half buried in the flagstone. "A securing point," he mused. "Something was hauled, lowered, or counterbalanced. A crude mechanism, perhaps, but sufficient." "For what?" I asked. He gave a rare, cold smile. "For sound, Watson. For sound to echo as though from the lips of the dead." That evening, Miss Brand requested a word in private and presented Holmes with a bundle of letters, tied together with blue ribbon and marked in her own handwriting. Her expression was troubled as she set them on the desk. "These were posted from Greyshollow over the past month," she explained. "All sent to my sister in Tunbridge Wells. She finally replied, saying she had received only one. I feared interference, and when I examined them..." Holmes untied the bundle and inspected the edges with the lens. Several envelopes bore tiny tears near the wax seals, and faint adhesive smudges suggested they had been opened and resealed by unskilled hands. "The Colonel employs no valet?" Holmes asked. "None. Only the housekeeper and the gardener, both as secretive as their master." Holmes held a letter to the light. "Your handwriting is neat, Miss Brand, and your thoughts measured. Someone found them worth intercepting, perhaps fearing what they might reveal, or recall." She looked away. "There are things I have seen in that house, Mr. Holmes. Things I have not put to paper." "Then you must speak them soon," Holmes said softly. "For written silence is the easiest to burn." The following morning we encountered the estate gardener, a stooped, broad-shouldered man named Noel, with weather-beaten hands and eyes like wet gravel. Holmes approached him with his usual polite detachment, inquiring as to any activity near the chapel grounds. Noel muttered about mists and hares and the decay of old stone, but his gaze remained fixed on the earth, and he refused to meet our eyes. When Holmes asked directly whether he had seen anyone near the ruins at night, the man's jaw tightened, and he spat into the mud before walking away without a word. "A man who says too little, Watson," Holmes observed, "often knows too much." That afternoon, we made our way to the village of Dunsfold, a scattering of cottages clustered around a church and public house. Holmes engaged several locals in conversation over a quiet pint and a well-placed coin or two. The tales flowed easily of the cursed hill, of ghostly monks seen flitting among the stones, and most frequently of the bell. "They say it tolled again," murmured the innkeeper's wife. "The very night Miss Agnes went missing. Just once. Deep, like a grave breathing." Holmes thanked her and turned to me. "The legend persists because it feeds upon itself. But somewhere in the telling, truth is hidden like a nail in a loaf." Our final encounter that day was with Colonel Ambrose Vane himself, a man of few words and fewer emotions. He received us in his study, seated stiffly beside a cold hearth, his military moustache bristling and eyes like unpolished steel. "My daughter will return," he said curtly. "She is prone to sulking. This is not the concern of police or detectives." Holmes regarded him steadily. "You believe she left of her own will?" "I do." "And the bell?" Holmes asked lightly. "Old stones creak. Wind plays tricks," Vane replied, rising to indicate the interview was at an end. "This is a family matter, Mr. Holmes. I suggest you leave it so." Outside, Holmes muttered, "A man who guards silence so fiercely must fear the sound of truth." The days which followed our arrival at Grace Hollow were marked by a growing and inescapable sense of oppression, one which seemed to weigh not only upon the house and its inmates, but upon the very air itself. The fog, which had clung so faithfully to Drowning Hill, now seeped into the village and pressed against the windows of the estate like a smothering hand. It dulled the light, muted the sounds of everyday life, and cast an unnatural pallor over each waking hour. The staff, already reserved, became taciturn. The maid refused to venture beyond the hedge after sunset. Miss Brand, though resolute, wore signs of mounting anxiety in her eyes. Even I, with my stubborn adherence to the rationale, felt the strange unease of a place where nature itself seemed reluctant to intrude. It was not the grandeur of decay that troubled me, but the absence of life amidst it. Holmes was outwardly unaffected, yet I noticed that he kept his pipe constantly in motion, and that his violin, which might otherwise have lent us solace, remained untouched in its case. Something, I knew, was forming behind his gaze, some shape in the fog that had not yet declared its name. It was on the morning of the third day that the discovery was made. Noel the gardener, in his usual blunt fashion, informed us that the estate's mastiff, a creature named Brigo, had been found drowned in the mill pond which lay just beyond the slope of Drowning Hill. The hound, we were told, had been tied near the rear of the house the night before and had not been seen since. Holmes and I accompanied the gardener to the edge of the pond, where the body of the animal had been drawn from the black water and left upon the reeds. There was no sign of injury, no broken tether, no disturbance in the mud to suggest a struggle. Holmes knelt beside the carcass and examined it minutely. The paws are clean, no attempt to dig or resist, and yet the collar shows signs of having been cut. He glanced at Noel, who merely shrugged and muttered something inaudible. Holmes said nothing further to him. As we walked back toward the house, he turned to me and said, "There is a sequence here, Watson. If only we had the cipher. First a doll, discarded in haste. Now a loyal animal, silent and drowned. If fear were a tide, I would say it is rising." I could not shake the image of the dog's still form lying upon the reeds, as if the land itself had rejected the living. That same night, as darkness cloaked the hill once more, and a pale moon struggled through the mist, an uncanny hush fell over Greyshollow. Then, just after 9, a single sound cleaved the stillness. Low, hollow, and unmistakably bell-like. It was not loud, but it was clear, as though it had travelled not through air, but through bone. Within the hour, word had spread. The innkeeper's wife, the village curate, a shepherd returning from his field. Each swore upon their lives that they had heard the toll, though all agreed it had sounded but once. Miss Brand grew visibly pale when informed, and even the housekeeper was seen to cross herself beneath her apron. Holmes stood at the foot of the stairs when I returned with the reports. The sound, he said quietly, did not travel to the ear alone. It was aimed at the mind, a psychological blade, sharpened by folklore. You do not believe it was natural? I asked. I believe, he replied, that someone has learned how to strike not only a bell, but fear itself. And in doing so, they are preparing the ground for something worse. The following morning, we returned to the ruined chapel with renewed purpose. Holmes carried with him a satchel of instruments and an expression of fixed determination. The mist, which had become our constant companion, parted just enough to allow a sallow light through the clouds, and the stones of the chapel seemed less like a ruin than the stage of a theatre waiting for its next performance. Holmes began with the western wall, tracing the flagstones near the base of the altar with a fine bristled brush. I remained near the threshold, watching as he paused, examined something beneath his lens, and gave a small nod. Wax, he said. Melted, congealed, and flecked with ash. Someone has burned candles here recently, perhaps ritualistically, or perhaps for cover. He then turned his attention upward, climbing the broken stair toward the rafters where we had previously found the grooved beam. There, he pointed out subtle scratches, small indentations in the stone wall, parallel and purposeful, as though a rope had been pulled with some frequency. I would wager, he murmured, that a makeshift pulley was employed here, something to suspend a weighted object, a bell, perhaps, or a crude facsimile thereof. Surely no one could mistake that for a real peal, I protested. He raised a brow. You underestimate how little people require to confirm what they already fear. Holmes made one final inspection of the niche behind the altar before descending in silence. I followed him back into the mist, where the chapel loomed behind us, no less haunted for having been touched by reason. That evening found Holmes seated in his accustomed chair, his fingers steepled and his gaze fixed upon a distant point somewhere beyond the hearth. I had grown accustomed over the years to this posture, the body at rest while the mind chased wild and elusive prey through the labyrinths of logic. I did not speak to him, nor did he acknowledge my presence, save with a brief flicker of the eyes as I set a cup of tea beside him. He made no move toward it. Miss Brand joined us briefly but departed soon after, unnerved, I suspect, by the heavy silence that clung to the room. Even the ticking of the clock seemed an intrusion. I spent the next hour reviewing my notes, reflecting on the events. A child vanished, a bell heard where none existed, a dead dog, a ruined chapel with signs of recent manipulation, and above all, the presence of Colonel Vane, who had shown not sorrow, but something harder, colder, a kind of watchful restraint that bordered upon calculation. At last Holmes stirred. "Watson," he said, "do you believe in echoes?" "In the natural sense, of course." "And in the human sense?" I hesitated. "That depends." He stood. "We are not yet ready to strike, but the pieces are moving. Let us walk the grounds tonight. I wish to see how Drowning Hill sleeps when it believes no one watches." And so, without fanfare, the hunt began to stir in earnest. It was the morning following our moonlit walk when I returned to the chapel alone. Holmes had risen early and taken himself to the village on some errand he would not disclose, and I, left to my own devices, found my thoughts returning irresistibly to the altar ruins and the strange groove in the rafters. There remained in me the distinct feeling that something had been missed, not in the air or walls, but beneath our feet. The light was stronger now, piercing the chapel's ruined slats and throwing latticed shadows across the stone floor. As I paced slowly behind the altar, my foot struck something subtly uneven. It was not a stone, more a panel, cloaked by rotted debris and age. I knelt, brushed away a layer of damp leaves, and uncovered what appeared to be the edge of a hinged trap, its iron ring flush with the floor and nearly obscured by time. I tugged. It resisted at first, but with a groan the panel lifted upward, revealing a narrow stairwell cut roughly into the earth below. A cold breath rose from the opening, not the scent of decay, but of damp, stagnant air, untouched for weeks, perhaps longer. I hesitated only a moment before descending into the gloom, lantern in hand, my heart pounding with a mixture of dread and something perilously close to hope. The stairwell was crude, no more than a hewn tunnel descending at a slight angle, its walls lined in rough stone, slick with moisture. The light from my lantern played uneasily upon them, and the sound of my own breathing, confined in the narrow passage, echoed louder than seemed proper. At the bottom, the tunnel opened into a small subterranean chamber, scarcely more than 10 feet across. The space was dry, remarkably so, and bore the unmistakable signs of recent habitation. A woolen blanket, frayed but serviceable, was laid neatly atop a layer of straw in the corner. Near it sat a tin lantern, long since burned out, and beside that, a child's copy of Pilgrim's Progress with the name Agnes Vane written in careful hand upon the inside cover. Scattered about were other tokens of youth, a wooden soldier with one arm, a length of knotted string, and, incongruously, a half-eaten apple, browned with age yet unmistakably recent. Dust lay everywhere except upon these objects. They were not relics of a child once there, but proof of one recently gone. My throat tightened. This was no prison. It was a refuge, not the scene of abduction, but of retreat. And someone small, frightened, and resourceful, had lived here in secret. I waited for Holmes by the chapel gate, unable to descend again into that secret place until he had seen it for himself. When he arrived, his coat dusted with frost and eyes sharp with purpose, I led him without preamble to the hidden stair and down into the chamber below. He said little as he surveyed the scene, but I could see his gaze absorbing each detail. He crouched beside the blanket, sniffed the apple, turned the book over in his hand. Then, with a slow breath, he stood and looked at me with a new clarity. "She was not taken, Watson. She fled." I nodded. "And found sanctuary here." "Indeed. The objects are undisturbed, the bed neatly arranged, the selection of comforts deliberate, a child hiding, not imprisoned. But where is she now?" I asked. He paused, his eyes narrowing. "That," he said, "is the greater question. For I believe she was here until quite recently, but someone found her. Someone persuaded her to leave, perhaps through kindness, more likely through threat." He turned again to the passageway. "There is no sign of struggle. She left willingly, though I fear not freely." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the chamber's air. Holmes spoke not as one theorizing, but as one already forming a conclusion he dared not yet voice. That evening a storm broke over the hill once more, but it was not rain or thunder that drew us from our chairs. It was a scream, high, sharp, and distinctly human, carried on the wind from the direction of the chapel. Holmes was up in an instant, and I followed close behind, revolver in hand. We ascended the path at a run, our lanterns casting wild, leaping shadows through the swirling mist. Near the chapel wall, by the very threshold of the ruin, we found her. Miss Eliza Brand lay crumpled upon the ground, one arm flung above her head, her coat torn and muddied, her breathing shallow but present. Blood stained her temple, and a welt was already forming upon her brow. Holmes dropped to one knee beside her. "Alive," he murmured, but struck from behind. Likely a blow with the flat of something blunt. No fractures. It was then that I saw it. A scrap of parchment pinned to the lapel of her coat with a sewing needle. Holmes plucked it free and held it to the lantern's light. His expression did not change, but his voice lowered. "It says, 'The bell tolls for liars.'" The wind sighed through the chapel stones, and I felt, for the first time, something colder than fear. The knowledge that we had stepped from mystery into malevolence. Holmes examined the scrap closely beneath the lantern glow. The hand was angular, almost jagged, and clearly disguised, though perhaps not by one unfamiliar with penmanship. The ink had smudged in places, likely from contact with Miss Brand's coat during her collapse, but the message remained legible and chilling. He held it between gloved fingers. "It is not a threat merely. It is a declaration. Someone believes Miss Brand has lied and seeks to mark her publicly for it." "Lied about what?" I asked. "About the girl's disappearance, her flight to London, the letters?" Holmes said nothing for a moment, then folded the note with care and placed it in his coat. "It is not the content of the lie that matters to the sender," he said at last, "but the label of the liar. This is no ordinary warning, Watson. It is ritualistic, deliberate, symbolic." We carried Miss Brand back to the house between us. The servants, roused and aghast, did little beyond offering blankets and brandy. Colonel Vane appeared briefly in the stairwell, said nothing, and vanished again. Later, as I sat by her bedside and listened to her uneven breathing, I asked Holmes quietly whether he believed the girl was still alive. He turned to me, eyes dark as the chapel rafters. "Yes," he said. "But for how long, I cannot say. The bell has rung again, and this time it tolls for blood." It was past midnight when Holmes, having sat in stillness for nearly an hour beside Miss Brand's bedside, beckoned me silently from the room. We descended the stairs without a word, and once in the drawing room, he lit the lamp with deliberate care before speaking in low, even tones. "We are dealing with a performance, Watson," he began. "A ritual designed not only to frighten but to control. The bell is both symbol and signal, and we must now take command of its toll." He opened his satchel and withdrew a compact apparatus, a coiled length of cord, a bronze dinner bell fitted with a modified clapper and a small weight. "This," he said, holding it up, "when affixed to the beam and released from above, should create the precise timbre heard by our villagers." "You mean to sound it yourself?" "Precisely. But not from within the chapel. I will toll it from the tree above the ridge. The acoustics are more deceptive from there. Meanwhile, you, Watson, shall conceal yourself among the chapel's shadows." "And what do we await?" He turned, and his eyes gleamed with that familiar light, the one I had come to know as the prelude to capture. "The toll draws him. The lie reveals him. And tonight, the echo shall speak his name." I took my post just beyond the chapel's threshold, crouched low behind a fractured slab of stone where bramble and fog merged into a kind of living shroud. Holmes had departed silently into the night, his steps light upon the frost-dusted path as he made his ascent toward the ridge. The air was damp and utterly still. Even the wind, which so often played its mournful tune through the chapel stones, held its breath. My heart beat steadily, but my ears strained against the quiet, catching at every distant rustle, every imagined footfall. Time passed, or seemed to stretch unnaturally. As I remained in place, the lantern by my side extinguished, my eyes fixed upon the darkened rafters above. The beam with the groove loomed directly overhead, still bearing its silent wound. Then, at last, a sound. Not a rustle, not the shifting of stone, but a resonance. A low, deliberate toll that vibrated not through the ears but through the chest. It echoed once, then again, and then fell still. I gripped the revolver in my coat pocket, though I prayed I would not have cause to use it. Holmes had sounded the bell. Now we waited to see who would come. No sooner had the third toll faded into silence than a faint shift in the fog drew my attention. A shape, a cloaked figure, tall and measured in movement, emerged from the western edge of the chapel, entering not by the central path, but slipping in through the crumbled arch on the side. The figure paused, listening. Then, with an eerie deliberation, it moved toward the interior. I scarcely dared to breathe as I observed it cross the nave, step over the cracked flagstones, and ascend with practiced ease the worn stairway to the rafters above. It moved not as one discovering, but as one repeating a well-rehearsed act. From my vantage I saw the figure draw a length of rope from beneath its cloak and affix it to the old pulley beam. It then lifted what appeared to be a weighted metal object, a crude assembly of iron and wood, and suspended it in place. A small lantern was lit, barely more than a flicker, just enough to guide the hands in their work. Then came the toll again, but this time not Holmes's device. This was real. A deliberate heavy chime that vibrated through the timbers and echoed down into the chapel hollow. My breath caught. The bell had been rebuilt, or perhaps it had never been truly lost, and above me its architect tolled once more. It was then, as the fourth toll rose and fell, that Holmes stepped from the mist at the chapel's rear. He moved without haste, yet with such quiet certainty that the figure above did not detect him until he had crossed halfway through the nave. "Colonel Vane," Holmes called up, his voice cutting cleanly through the fog. "That will suffice." The figure froze. There was a pause, a tightening of shoulders, and then the slow, deliberate turn of a cloaked head. "Mr. Holmes," came the voice from above, low and composed. "So you heard it too." "I heard you," Holmes replied, "and I heard enough." The man descended, slowly, without resistance, his cloak falling back to reveal the pale, austere face of Colonel Ambrose Vane. There was no sign of panic, only the faint trace of something unreadable, weariness, perhaps, or a kind of bleak resignation. "You are armed?" Holmes asked me. I nodded. "Then I believe we may return to the house," Holmes said. "The hour grows late, and our host has much to explain." Vane said nothing more. He walked ahead of us, silent and dignified, like a man accompanying his own funeral procession. We seated Colonel Vane in the study, the hearth now lit and casting uneasy shadows against the dark panelled walls. He sat straight-backed in the high armchair, hands folded, gaze steady, as though he were receiving guests rather than facing inquiry. Holmes stood before him, arms crossed. I took the seat at the desk, my pen poised but silent. "You toll the bell," Holmes began, "yet the bell was thought destroyed." Vane inclined his head. "The frame remained intact. I merely rebuilt the rest." "Why?" He looked to the fire. "It calls them, the voices. They whisper when it tolls. It keeps them away when I sound it." "Who, precisely?" "The monks, the watchers. They linger in the hill. You cannot see them, but they are there." Holmes's expression did not change. "You believe this?" "I know it," Vane replied, his tone measured but curiously void of conviction. "The bell is their signal. It must be answered. If not, they come." Holmes glanced at me, then stepped forward. "And your daughter? Was she also a part of this rite? or merely an inconvenience? A flicker passed across Vane's face, something between guilt and defiance. She saw what she should not have seen, he said quietly. She spoke of her mother, of that night. I could not allow that. Not again. Holmes's voice dropped to a whisper. So, you frightened her into hiding, and when Miss Brand found her, you struck. Vane closed his eyes. The toll, he murmured, was never meant for them. It was for me. Holmes turned away then, his voice clipped. A madness, yes, but one with too much method to be innocent. And in the firelight, the toll still echoed, not from the hill, but from the mind of a man undone by memory. We returned to the manor in the deepest hush of the night. Colonel Vane walked ahead of us without protest, his hands unbound but his posture stiff, as if he were already under sentence. Holmes did not speak as we passed through the hallway, where a servant, roused from sleep, stood frozen at the sight of her master, flanked by two grim silhouettes. Miss Brand, bruised but upright, awaited us in the drawing-room. At the sight of Vane, her lips parted as though to speak, but Holmes gave her a single subtle gesture. Silence for now. The house seemed to absorb the tension like a sponge. Even the fire burned with a quieter crackle. The portraits on the walls, those long-dead Vanes, looked down with an air of solemn judgment. Colonel Vane seated himself without instruction. He did not ask what was expected of him, nor did he demand his innocence. There was no outburst, no denial, only an eerie composure, as though he had long suspected this moment would come. Holmes remained standing, his eyes upon the man who had, until now, controlled the house through silence and shadow. But at last, the silence would speak. Holmes turned to me with quiet firmness. Watson, if you would be so good. It was all the instruction I needed. I ascended the stairs and turned toward the east wing, where a narrow servants' passage led to a lesser-used section of the upper floor. At the end of a corridor thick with dust and years of disuse, I found the door precisely where Holmes had described it. A panel set, flush into the wall, near invisible, but for the faint scrape of disturbed wood along the skirting. The latch gave way easily under my hand. Within, the air was stale. The space small, a cramped attic alcove, where a cot, a pitcher of water, and a blanket had been arranged with Spartan care. And there, curled in the corner like a startled bird, sat Agnes Vane. Her eyes were wide with a child's terror, but also with recognition. She clutched a cloth doll to her chest, one I had not seen in the chapel. It's all right, I said gently, lowering myself to her level. Your governess is safe. And you are safe now too. She nodded once, and after a pause, took my outstretched hand. When I returned to the drawing room with the girl in my arms, Miss Brand gasped and hurried forward. Agnes buried herself in her governess's shoulder and said nothing. But Holmes nodded, as though the final piece of the puzzle had settled into place. Once the child was seated, warm and comforted beside Miss Brand, Holmes addressed us all in a voice that was neither accusatory nor cruel, but grave with certainty. There are memories, he began, that lie not in the mind, but in the marrow. They may not speak, but they ring, like bells. He glanced at Agnes. Years ago, she saw something no child should see. The death of her mother, violent, sudden, and made more terrible by the fact that it came at her father's hand. A shiver passed through the room, though the fire was full. She did not understand it then, but she remembered it. And when her father's temper returned, when the door slammed too hard or his voice rose in anger, some part of that memory stirred within her. Miss Brand held the child tightly, her own eyes brimming. She found refuge, Holmes continued, first in silence, then in the chapel, and finally in the attic wing, an oubliette of her own design. And Vane, rather than face the truth of his guilt, fed the legend. He revived the bell, dressed his madness in superstition, and struck fear into those who came too close, He turned to Vane. Your daughter did not flee monsters, Colonel. She fled you. Vane's head bowed, not in anger, but in something far more desolate, the weary collapse of a man who had lost the one soul he might yet have saved. Holmes moved to the hearth, lifting a taper to light his pipe, though he did not smoke it. He let the match burn down between his fingers before dropping it to the grate. The tolling of the bell was no haunting, he said, but an orchestration. A device reconstructed from memory and guilt. The pulley rig, the suspended clapper, the hollow resonance of a makeshift shell, all calculated to echo through the hill like the ghost of a warning. He turned to face us. And what better hiding place for a child than a ruin feared by all? Vane's intentions may have been unconscious at first, but in time, the symbolism consumed him. He became priest, architect, and ward of his own penitential order. Colonel Vane said nothing. His face remained pale and unreadable, though his fingers had begun to tremble. You did not seek to harm her, Holmes added. You sought to distance her, to silence the reminder, but in doing so, you enacted the very terror she had learned to fear. He gestured toward Agnes, whose head now rested against Miss Brand's shoulder. Children have long memories, Colonel, not always clear, but keen. There was no reply. Vane merely closed his eyes, as if to retreat into the one place where the bell did not toll. Holmes turned next to Miss Brand, who still held the girl in her lap. One protective arm curled around her as though to shield her from the very walls of the house. You suspected, Holmes said gently, not from deduction, but from instinct. The missing food, the movement in the walls, the creak of a board you knew too well. You followed that instinct and found her. Miss Brand nodded slowly. I found her 2 days before I came to you. She was frightened but not wild. She let me bring her water, food, stories. But she made me promise not to tell anyone, not even you. Holmes inclined his head. And when you did not return the following evening, she fled again. I'd gone to speak to the Colonel, she said, voice low. I thought, if I could reason with him. You could not, Holmes said quietly. And for your compassion, he struck you. She said nothing, but the bruise along her temple spoke clearly. Your courage, Miss Brand, may very well have saved the child's life. Miss Brand's eyes glistened, but she did not weep. Agnes stirred in her arms, nestled deeper, and the governess whispered something only the child could hear. Holmes stepped forward, his final summation as precise as ever, though tinged with something more human than triumph. Guilt, Colonel Vane, is a cunning craftsman. It tolls a bell only you can hear, then convinces you that others must hear it too. You built your punishment piece by piece, sound, symbol, solitude, and mistook it for protection. Vane looked up, the mask cracking. Holmes continued, voice level. Your mind did not break. It conspired. You did not forget the truth. You rewrapped it, dressed it in folklore, and forced others to believe in phantoms so they would not see the man behind the toll. Then he turned to me, and his tone shifted to one of quiet finality. And thus we arrive, Watson, not at the foot of a legend, but the threshold of a sorrow too long denied. Outside, the wind stirred again, but this time it brought no sound of bells. It was some days later, beneath a gentler sky and in the familiar comfort of our rooms at Baker Street, that Holmes and I found ourselves once more in our accustomed armchairs. The fire burned low, its light flickering across the brims of teacups and the contours of long-practiced silence. The scent of coal and old papers had never seemed more welcome. Holmes had spoken little during our return journey from Kent, and I had not pressed him. The case, while not our most perilous, had struck at something more elemental, something quieter and deeper than mere crime. Now at last, with time as our cushion and the city's dull hum beyond the panes, I ventured a question. You knew, I said, from the first mention of the bell. I suspected, he replied, gazing into the hearth. But suspicion is no substitute for truth. It had to toll in flesh before it could toll in fact. Outside, the fog crept softly past the windows, but within, the sharp edges of that cursed hill had dulled into memory, still heavy, but no longer suffocating. We were home, and the mystery had receded, though not, perhaps, the sorrow it left behind. Holmes rose, as was his habit, and retrieved a sheet of notepaper from the mantel. With his pipe clenched between his teeth and his fingers smudged faintly with graphite, he began to outline the apparatus with which Colonel Vane had manufactured his auditory haunting. The key, he said, lay in simplicity. The remnants of the original bell were never fully removed, only buried and forgotten. Vane unearthed the lower casting and fashioned a crude clapper, suspended by rope through a makeshift pulley beam reinforced at the top of the chapel ruin. He traced the system in the air with his finger. The groove in the beam showed recent wear. The iron ring secured the rope, and the hollowed stone niche acted as a resonator. When struck, it amplified the tone in precisely the right register to mimic the lost bell of St. Ethelric's. And the wax, I asked, recalling the faint residue Holmes had pointed out near the altar. Used to seal the hinge of the trap door, he replied. Its presence indicated a desire for silence, stealth. Vane did not wish to be heard descending into that chamber. It was a place of hiding, not ceremony. He tapped his pipe thoughtfully. What fascinated me most was the manipulation of distance. The bell was never where it was heard. The sound was displaced by design, exploiting the hill's natural acoustics to confuse direction and origin. It was the work of a soldier's mind, precise, tactical, and tragically misplaced. In essence, he concluded, he rang not for others, but for himself, hoping to drown his memory in echoes. Holmes returned to his chair, his voice quieter now, reflective. It is a curious thing, he said, how guilt, when left unexamined, does not diminish, but metastasizes. Vane was not mad in the clinical sense, Watson. At least not at the outset. He was a man who had committed an unforgivable act, and had survived it by dividing himself into compartments. He leaned back, fingers steepled. One part of him mourned, another punished, a third fabricated ghosts to guard the threshold between the two. I nodded slowly. And when the child remembered, however faintly, that barrier collapsed. Precisely. Agnes's memories, buried though they were, acted as a trigger. Her retreat into silence threatened to make the unspoken speak. Vane responded not by confronting the truth, but by reasserting the myth, strengthening the toll of the bell, heightening the fear surrounding the chapel. The lie became a refuge, the bell a lamentation. I was struck anew by the tragic symmetry of the thing, a man trying to silence the very echo he himself had set in motion. He built a religion out of guilt, Holmes added, and dressed his daughter in the vestments of its sacrifice. It was not villainy, Watson, but cowardice, cloaked in ritual. I saw then that Holmes, despite his calm exterior, carried no satisfaction from this case. Only the weight of a truth revealed too late to mend what had already been broken. Before we left Greysollow, arrangements had been made with quiet haste. Colonel Vane, though not imprisoned in the legal sense, had placed himself into voluntary seclusion, a facility recommended by a discreet contact of Holmes's, where matters of the mind were treated with firm compassion and without scandal. Miss Brand had tendered her resignation from the Vane household on the same morning, placing into Holmes's hands a sealed letter addressed to the Colonel. She never disclosed its contents, nor did he ever speak of receiving it, but I would like to believe it carried more grace than accusation. Agnes, for her part, had clung to her governess with the desperate strength of a child who has weathered too many silences. It was clear from the first that she would not remain at the manor, and Holmes, with a few words to the appropriate authorities, ensured that guardianship was transferred without contest. When we took our leave, the girl stood beside Miss Brand on the manor's threshold. She did not speak, but she did wave, a gesture faint but certain. It was not a goodbye, but an acknowledgement of having been seen. Holmes tipped his hat to her, his expression unreadable. As we turned toward the carriage, he remarked softly, "There are ghosts that must be exorcised not by priest or pistol, but by patience." And so we left the hill behind us, its bells silenced, its secrets spoken, and its echoes slowly receding into memory. The final embers of October glowed faintly in the hearth, casting long shadows across the familiar contours of our sitting room in Baker Street. Outside, the wind swept through the narrow streets with a voice both mournful and restless, as though London itself were sifting through forgotten thoughts. Within, all was calm. Holmes sat in his armchair, one leg crossed over the other, his gaze fixed not on the flames, but upon some private theatre behind the veil of his mind. The case of the Drowning Hill bell lay behind us, and yet, like many of our most curious ventures, its echoes lingered, subtle, persistent, and deeply human. I had finished my notes and closed the leather-bound journal in which I recorded our more delicate investigations. For some time we sat in companionable silence, each wrapped in our own musings. It was Holmes who at last broke it, not with analysis or a fresh theory, but with something altogether rarer. "There are bells, Watson," he said slowly, "that toll not for death nor warning, but for remembrance, and it is those that ring the longest." The fire cracked once, and we let the thought settle. Holmes rose to replenish his pipe, his movements deliberate and unusually quiet. As the flame took the tobacco, he did not return immediately to his chair, but stood before the window, gazing out into the shadowed street below. "You will recall," he said, "that Colonel Vane spoke of whispers on the hill, voices he claimed to hear before each toll." I nodded. "I believe him," Holmes continued, "not in the literal sense, but in the only sense that matters. The voices were his own, unspoken truths that had fermented too long in silence. They needed release, and so he gave them ritual. A man haunted by guilt often finds it easier to believe in ghosts than in the weight of his own memory. He turned then, the light catching the sharp lines of his face. It is not superstition that tolls in the minds of men. It is conscience. And no church bell ever struck louder. I had seen Holmes dissect many a criminal with the blade of logic, but this was something deeper, an incision not into motive, but into sorrow itself. For once, he did not seek to solve, only to understand. It was, in its own way, the final deduction. I stirred in my chair and looked into the coals, musing aloud as Holmes resumed his seat. "Perhaps," I said, "the myths we inherit, the bells that toll, the monks in the mist, the voices that rise from the hill, perhaps they serve a purpose, not in truth, but in tenderness, a veil, however thin, between the human heart and the cruelties it cannot yet endure." Holmes inclined his head, though he said nothing. "I have seen many men broken not by pain, but by clarity. Some truths strike harder than fists, and leave wounds which no doctor can bind. In such cases, might it not be mercy to allow myth its place, to let the legend speak, when the truth is still too sharp?" He considered this a moment before answering. "You speak, Watson, as one who feels." "I am a physician," I replied. "I know what pain sounds like when it cannot speak its name." Holmes's eyes softened, and for a moment I saw not the detective, but the man beneath, the one whose mind could map a crime scene in a glance, yet still pause to honour the ache of the soul. The silence that followed needed no translation. Holmes tapped the ash from his pipe and leaned forward, his gaze steady, his tone composed. You are correct, Watson, in the observation that some myths serve to shelter. But truth, like the bell, cannot remain buried forever. Sooner or later, it will ring again. He gestured lightly, as if conducting an invisible toll. And the longer it is muffled, the more thunderous its eventual sound. We sat for a while without speech, listening to the soft hiss of the coals and the muffled stir of wheels in the street below. The world moved on, indifferent and unchanged, yet within the walls of our small haven, something quiet had resolved. Perhaps, I said at last, that is the role of men like you, not to silence the bell, but to ensure that when it does ring, it tolls for truth and not fear. Holmes said nothing, but the faintest curve touched the corner of his mouth. I rose, placed another log on the fire, and opened my journal once more. And thus I closed the tale of the bell at Drowning Hill, not as a legend laid to rest, but as a truth brought forth into the light, that it might never have cause to toll again. Holmes stirred from his chair, and after a long pause said quietly, "It is often the ghost within a man, Watson, not the one whispered about in legends, that does the greatest haunting." I glanced at him from across the fire. "And in this case?" He exhaled through his nose. "He built a bell to frighten others, yet every toll was an echo of his own remorse. It is a peculiar kind of justice, is it not, when the mind manufactures its own punishment?" I nodded, then asked, "Do you believe it was guilt or fear that truly drove him?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. "Perhaps both. But I rather think it was memory, dressed as myth, that proved most unforgiving. What do you think? Was Colonel Vane truly mad, or did he know exactly what he was doing? Before you go, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes mysteries, and if you enjoyed the story, share it with a friend who loves a good puzzle. Until next time, the game is never truly over.